can I secretly record my housing officer? Now, this is not a question that was asked on any of the comment section, but it's a question that came up again in the casework I do in Bedford. And it's a really interesting one, and it might seem like a really distasteful answer in which I'm going to give, but just to kind of explain why this question is even asked and why the answer is actually important. I've worked in 3 different councils in my time, and certainly in one council, in Bedford Borough Council, I witnessed my boss falsifying legal documentation. I saw my team laugh about changing records when a complaint came in order to, to say that they had done something when they hadn't. I saw a whole bunch of other stuff, manufacture of evidence, all those kind of things. And it's not just Bedford Borough Council, and in many ways they've improved their culture quite a lot since I was there. But certainly, within any setting where professionals have a lot of power over service users, whatever terminology you want to use, there is going to be this risk that that power is badly abused. And I think, I've said it in my training that we do, that I'm not aware of another situation in the country where there is such a great a power imbalance as there is between a housing officer and a homeless person, and part of that's because the housing officer's not got any special training necessarily. They're not registered to any kind of body of housing officers. There's no kind of like registration process or anything like that there would be with a social worker. And ultimately, there's very little kind of scrutiny of what they do. Often you've got this situation where you've got a housing officer in a private interview room, and kind of, whatever they say will be believed. And this kind of leads on to a couple of cases I want to kind of talk about to answer this question of whether you can secretly record a professional of any kind, but particularly a housing officer. And there was a case, there's a number of cases I'm going to look at, and just to say I'm not a lawyer, don't be using this as legal advice. If you should be getting your own legal advice if you're going to do something like this or rely on it in court. But there was a case where it was a child protection case actually, where the mother was having regular contact with the foster parents. I'm assuming just as part of the arrangements of looking after the child, and essentially the foster parent was being regularly incredibly abusive and unpleasant. And the mother raised this with social services, and social services very predictably just believed the foster carer who said, no, it wasn't me being rude. It was the parent being rude, and I was trying to just manage the situation really well. So the mother, what she actually did was she covertly recorded the interactions with them, and what the recording showed is that actually the foster parent was being overtly racist and very, very aggressive, verbally aggressive to the mum. And ultimately that kind of changed the case. And the question in that case was that information, was that recording admissible in court? It's not that you're probably going to go to court with this stuff, but certainly there's other cases. And again, if you just get on Google just to look at this, if you want to just satisfy yourself that this is correct, there's a case called Vaughan v Lewisham, and in this case it was actually an employment law case where an employee, and again I don't know the full details, but the employee was presumably subject to some disciplinary process, and what she did was she put a phone on record in her bag whilst the meeting was taking place. And interestingly, halfway through the meeting, the whatever the decision makers, the bosses, whatever, they asked her to step outside the room so they could discuss the situation and what to do. And interestingly, the recorder kept going. The phone kept recording those private conversations between the decision makers, between the hierarchy people, whatever. And again, the question in that case was the recording admissible in court? And by implication, whether the recording would be admissible in any of these processes. So whether it would be admissible in the complaints process or the appeal process or whatever. And interesting, as I say, in this case, whether the recording, not only the recording when she was in the room with these other colleagues, but was the recording admissible when she stepped out of the room and she was not there? And in that case, essentially, they said the recording while she was in the room was admissible, but the recording when she stepped out of the room was not admissible. So this kind of leads on to a number of different questions that kind of come out of this. So the first question is, often people think you can't do this because of data protection law. And data protection law does come into play a little bit, but it's not something which stops you making secret recordings. So essentially, if you're going to do this, and all I can say is if I was homeless, I would do this. If I was ever speaking to a housing officer, I would be recording it. But basically, if you are going to do this, you can't then just kind of share that recording around willy-nilly. You essentially, as far as I can tell, you would need to keep the recording, can proceed with the process. And in my opinion, and this is kind of a playing it safe opinion, you'd raise what was said. If say there was a complaint about who said what, you'd raise the complaint, and then if the professional then lied about it, you could produce the recording to say, actually, hold on a minute, this isn't the case. Now, I've done this once with a client a long time ago. Again, with the client's consent and the client's making the decision, and in that case, it kind of got down to the point where in the course of that conversation, the client had basically, had been asked, have you got any medical conditions? And the client's answer was, yes, I've got alcoholism, I've just been discharged from hospital, and then proceeded to say what medication. And the housing officer in that case even got the client to spell out the name of these different medications that they were on. And as the complaint process went on, the housing officer said, they never mentioned any medical conditions they were kind of subject to. At which point I produced this recording and said, hang on a minute, that's not the case. This guy spelled out the names of the medication he was on. So that's kind of how you might use it, is you might keep the recording until you need it, until your version of events is kind of, or essentially until a housing officer lies, you kind of just keep it to yourself. And kind of on that point, if you're going to do this, it may not be relevant for a year, so if you're going to make recordings of housing officers in these kind of situations, you need to make sure you don't lose it. You need to make sure, essentially, if you're going to have several conversations, you probably want to keep some notes and kind of keep some references as to who said what when. Because if you're having 2-hour conversations or 2-hour interviews with a housing officer, it's actually quite time consuming to go back and find out when someone said what they said. So yeah, that's kind of what I'd say is, certainly if I was doing it, I would be making recordings, keeping them nice and safe. And now a few more things I'd say about this is that we live in this world of smartphones. I've never used a smartphone in my life pretty much, so I keep a Nokia. But basically, as I understand it, there are various apps that will actually record conversations very simply that you're having in real time on your phone. So it's not difficult to do this. And within the court judgments I've seen relevant to this is there doesn't seem to have been much of a question about whether the type of recording device was important. I think what you'd probably need to do is show that you haven't altered or edited the file later on. And again, technologically speaking, I don't quite know how you do that. I would assume if you had the recording in an app, that may well be enough to show that you haven't kind of doctored it or anything like that. Certainly within these kind of cases, just a normal recording on a normal kind of everyday publicly available device was admissible in court. I have heard stories about the DWP saying that you can only record meetings if you're using a particular kind of particularly secure type of technology, but it doesn't seem that that's the case. And the final thing I'll say about this, because I appreciate this, it really upsets professionals, but it's interesting that when you hear people talk about this, because what professionals tend to say is like, I feel like I'm in the dock. I feel like anything I can say can be used against me. I feel like something I say could be kind of taken out of context. And actually, that's just the reality for every homeless person. Everything they're saying, they're kind of worried about, or they're very nervous that it's going to get used out of context or used against them. And so really, all you're doing is you're just increasing transparency and accountability. And again, as I've said in other videos, I really wish it wasn't down to homeless people to hold organisations to account, but it is. Unfortunately, professionals generally will not want to rock the boat for various reasons, and ultimately that means it's down to you if you want to ensure that you're being treated fairly. That's not to say if you're not treated fairly, it's in any way your fault. These are big organisations. These are experienced housing officers a lot of the time who are doing these dirty tricks. And again, I guess just want to say as well, it's not every housing officer, it really isn't. But certainly when I worked in Bedford as an example, it seemed to me that the prevailing culture was one of getting rid of people, fobbing people off. And as I say, there would be specific instructions from one of the team leaders to essentially just, he said things like make the evidence fit, or use the test that gets rid of people first, which is ultimately something. Yeah, it's really, really dodgy. It's really dirty sort of stuff, and it's not that unusual. So whilst I hope that everyone gets a really good housing officer who is honest and decent and transparent and just kind of fair in that process, there isn't any guarantee you're going to get that. And this kind of idea of recording, I think, is it is a game changer. Police body cams is another kind of way in which kind of these recordings can increase accountability. But ultimately, it's far from certain that you're going to get treated fairly during these processes. I can say is that if I was homeless and I had any doubt at all that I was not getting dealt with fairly, I'd be recording those sessions. and keeping a record of them and using them potentially down the line to just show that I'm not the one who's lying. And again, just fine, sorry, I keep making more and more tangents, but within a lot of complaints I kind of deal with, you have a situation where you've got someone who is perfectly intelligent, perfectly articulate, has a really good memory, obviously is going to remember things about the way they were dealt with, because it happened to them, and it's a massively important thing at the time. And then the council will simply dismiss that and say, well, we don't have a record of that, so we can't prove that happened. And actually, in my opinion, that's not the correct approach from councils. When councils investigate complaints and they investigate these issues, they should be looking at things in terms of, they should be making a kind of a balance of probabilities type assessment. So if you've got an individual who is not known for dishonesty, who is intelligent, has no reason to doubt their memory, if they remember that something was said or something happened, and the housing officer just didn't make a note about it, and let's face it, housing officers have got 80 different clients, so their memory of specific situations is not going to be great. I would say that the homeless individual should be believed every time in that situation. As I say, unless there is some kind of dishonesty conviction or dishonesty kind of, something that's exposed them to be dishonest in a previous situation, the default position should be to believe them. So yeah, hopefully this is helpful. Sounds really depressing. As I say, it's distasteful. That was a word that the judge used in the Vaughan v Lewisham case. But yeah, ultimately, I hope it does help, and I hope that homeless people can be treated decently. And unfortunately, in my opinion, this is necessary to actually help that happen. Keep the questions coming. I will try my best to answer questions as well as I can. And as I say, I hope this stuff is useful. I hope it is in some way an encouragement to people in that situation, because I'm not being homeless myself, but very clear it's horrendous, and being treated unfairly in those kind of processes is often what people say is the most difficult